Welcome everybody today. We would like to welcome our expert speaker, Gail Wessels, to our discussion. She is an expert in GRC and has 20 years of experience in the space and as well as legal counsel. And Gail, thank you so much for joining us today. I think we're going to have an excellent conversation on a number of really fascinating whistleblowing topics. So welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you to you, and thank you to Speak Up for inviting me to Amsterdam. It's a place that I love, so it's really great being here. So yes, today we're going to be talking about the humanised approach to governance, risk and compliance. So it's all really about looking at people as being at the centre of governance, risk and compliance. Let's unpack what I mean by governance, risk and compliance. It's very much about leadership, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It's about how organizations are led and managed and how well organizations subscribe to those principles of trust, transparency, fairness, ethics, accountability. Now, whistleblowing, or speak up, listen to and act, is a critical part of that, of the way an organization is led and managed. So whistleblowing and a speak up, listen to and act culture is very much about how leaders ask the right questions and increase their level of awareness as to what's really going on. Now you might ask, why do I have these views? I've been very fortunate to help various organizations in implementing a whistleblowing framework, from working with a huge bank, implementing a speak-up culture as part of their culture of compliance and anti-money laundering, to helping an organization implement a whistleblowing program pre-EU directive and local law, and then also being part of the team that dealt and was responsible for managing whistleblowing reports. So I've lived through those experiences. Some of them have been more positive than others. And my key takeaway is that whistleblowing or speak up, listen to and act culture is complex. It is about humans. And we know that, as humans we are nuanced and we change. And that makes whistleblowing and this particular topic very hard to ensure perfection, because it just doesn't exist. So in a sense of managing expectations for today's session, we'll probably walk out with more questions than answers.
That's always the case, no?
Absolutely. So basically just to manage those expectations. But again, it's not about perfection. I don't think it exists.
Okay.
It's about working towards something better.
Okay.
So it's great if we walk away with more questions, because then hopefully we'll be challenged to find the answers.
Absolutely, and I think that will lead us hopefully into another conversation. So for those of you who are just joining now, a few notes on today's session. Duration will be roughly 40 to 45 minutes. We'll have audience question and answer period at the end of the presentation, and we may have a couple of polls to engage you in the midst of the presentation. Again, my name is Robert Greco. I'm legal director at Speak Up, and I am joined by my esteemed guest, Gail Wessels. So Gail, let's start with the big picture. You're already painting it for us. Whistleblowing, as we know it, is seen as a compliance necessity. But you talk about it as part of organizational resilience. Could you share what that means in today's business context?
Well, let's unpack what we mean by organizational resilience. It's very much about increasing our ability to anticipate, prepare, respond, and adapt to our environment, And our environment is often referred to as a VUCA environment. It's another
Can you expand on VUCA for those of us not familiar with the acronym?
volatile,
Mhm.
uncertain, complex, ambiguous.
Oh, yes.
I almost forgot that one.
It's ambiguous.
Yeah, absolutely. So add to that increased scrutiny, increased competition,
Mhm.
and it makes for a very challenging environment. So when we look at why we focus on whistleblowing and many other initiatives around GRC,
Mhm.
it's about enhancing resilience and ensuring that organizations and people are better placed to operate and succeed and excel in this VUCA environment.
Right.
Yeah. And how do I connect that with whistleblowing particularly? Whistleblowing is very much about an early warning system, isn't it?
Yeah.
Hmm?
Yeah.
It's about being proactive.
Mhm.
It's about understanding what is going on and responding to that. It's far more valuable to address concerns proactively as opposed to managing catastrophe.
Yes, the idea of managing a catastrophe is always something that is a call to action, but we need to find ways to focus on the early warning system as you identified it. So, can you take us through how we can do that in a more easily understandable way?
It starts with leaders caring about what's really going on.
Okay.
Okay. It's about leaders caring about the truth and the untruths and the perceptions. It's about creating that culture of respect and trust so that individuals feel empowered to speak up. Whistleblowing always also serves as a mirror, and sometimes we don't want to see what's in the mirror. So we need to understand that complexity, especially after an intense Christmas season.
Right.
We're probably all staring away from the mirror at the moment.
Right.
But on a more serious note, when it comes to whistleblowing, it serves to focus attention on what's really going on and to focus attention on aspects that we might not want to see.
Very interesting. Can you perhaps expand on this idea of things that we don't want to see? Are there some examples recently that you would like to touch on to bring that very clearly into focus for our viewers?
Okay. I reflect on two cases.
Okay.
For the purpose of this discussion.
Sure.
One is, of course, that of Boeing, and it highlights what happens when whistleblowers are ignored and stifled. So in the Boeing case, just a very quick summary, there were multiple whistleblowers who reported on safety concerns. Many issues were raised, but they were ignored. And we know this because of the intensive investigation that occurred.
After the fact.
After the fact,
Right.
Exactly. So that post-mortem highlighted the true extent of how whistleblowers were treated and the lack of supporting them. And not just supporting whistleblowers, but the lack of supporting a speak-up culture. And in that particular case, as a result of ignoring and shutting down concerns around safety relating to the 737 MAX plane, that, in conjunction with many other root causes, resulted in two horrific, catastrophic accidents where 346 people lost their lives.
It's sobering to hear that number, really, in the context of the whistleblowing reports that were ignored.
Exactly. Now, I'm not suggesting that that was the only cause,
Right.
but it was a significant root cause. And as you say, it is sobering, Because in the corporate landscape, sometimes we risk forgetting the true impact of getting it wrong.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's one example.
Okay.
And I would encourage listeners who would like to delve into the Boeing case to have a look at a documentary called Downfall.
Okay.
Quite an appropriate name, given that those two planes basically nosedived immediately after takeoff and killing everybody on board. So there's a very insightful documentary called Downfall. Of course, that relates to those two particular accidents, but we all know that in January of last year, we had the panel blowout on the Alaskan Airlines flight and subsequent occurrences. In the interest of time, I won't delve into that too much more. The other example would be of Wirecard, which was the darling of the fintech ecosystem in Germany, listed on the DAX. Was at one stage valued at a whopping 24 billion euros.
Yeah.
And when, again, multiple root causes, but when it became evident that there was 2 billion euros missing, there were some serious additional concerns around what was really going on in Wirecard. One of the whistleblowers in the Wirecard case is Pav Gill, and he talks a lot about his experiences in terms of the precursors to whistleblowing, trying to resolve, trying to address concerns and being ignored, being victimized as well. So again, there's a lot of literature available on Wirecard. Dan McCrum, the FT journalist who helped expose the shenanigans.
Right, for lack of a better term, yeah.
For lack of a better term. Who exposed all of that, wrote a book called Money Men.
Okay.
Super interesting.
Okay.
And then, of course, there's a documentary called Skandal, which helps us understand how these scenarios play out, and taking it back to the human impact as well, especially of those individuals who are trying to speak up. What are the key messages that I take away from these two examples? There are many, but I'm going to focus on two. Firstly, somebody always knows.
Okay. I think that's clearly obvious, especially when we look at it in retrospect. But please continue.
Second message. There is an immense disproportionate balance of power in favor of organizations and leaders.
So, in the context of these examples that you presented, we have on the one hand one of the two major manufacturers of airplanes that had, and there were a number of root causes, as you mentioned, but notably there were some whistleblower reports with respect to the safety of planes that ultimately resulted in the death of hundreds of people. And on the other side, you have the darling of the German fintech ecosystem, a rising jewel for the European economy on the DAX, missing 2 billion euros, who's to say where it went, and just collapsing. Somebody knew, and there was an imbalance of power. So how do we take that as a lesson going forward? Because, there is no sort of too big to fail in that context, as we've seen. So how would you advise leaders to internalize that and take a lesson forward so that they can hopefully avoid similar situations in their own organizations?
Leaders have quite a job.
No question. No question.
It's hard.
It is hard. Absolutely.
It is hard.
Yeah.
So as we, try and understand the context and the challenges that leaders are faced with, it helps us to better support those leaders, to support ourselves. Given your position at Speak Up, you are a significant leader in this organization. And it's important that you are supported in your role as well.
I hope so, yes.
And there's no one size fits all. There's no silver bullet.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that it's about helping leaders to expand their awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, leaders need to deliver on financial objectives. They need to keep the shareholders happy.
Always, always.
And we are seeing a huge increase in shareholder activism,
Mm-hmm. Okay.
increased scrutiny.
Yes,
You know, leaders have many balls up in the air at the same time.
certainly.
It's challenging,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and I've been there in different roles, as you have, and we can appreciate the increasing complexity of
Mm-hmm.
managing all those different objectives. But what leaders need more is support to understand that environment. Support in terms of increasing their level of awareness as to what's really going on.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I talk about what's really going on. Sounds like a great song, doesn't it? Maybe there is a song. But the point is, you know, on a serious note, is that leaders have an immense challenge.
Yes.
And it's about increasing that awareness, that perspective,
Mm-hmm.
having, you know, a different pair of glasses on
Mm-hmm.
to see the detail. And whistleblowing helps. And there's no perfection. It's a process. But leaders need to be supported by their senior managers,
Mm-hmm.
by the board of directors,
Yes.
by the shareholders, to appreciate that it's about getting to the truth.
Mm-hmm.
It's about being fair.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about looking at sometimes horrible images in the mirror, but that is the leadership responsibility. That's why you are a leader.
I think that's a really fantastic summary. I know it's some of the things that I have grappled with in this and in other roles, but there has an additional element that I think is making life complex for leaders, and that is whistleblowing, sort of in this modern context now. Leaks, the rise of leaking. How would you view whistleblowing through that modern lens, through the expansion of methods for disclosure of information that could be quite damaging?
Challenging question.
Okay.
Let's go back to what is leaking. You know,
Mhm.
leaking is the unauthorized release of sensitive material.
Mhm.
We know in our age of increased access to
Yes.
information and increased ability to publish that information as well. We know that everybody's a journalist in this day and age.
Yes.
Um,
For better or worse.
absolutely. There's also reduced fact checking of published information as well.
Also.
hmm So there are multiple challenging variables that leaders need to manage.
Mhm.
And the key message is that once that unauthorized release has taken place, the damage has been done. So leaders need to be prepared for that as well. And yes, it's about ensuring good data security and
Certainly.
the rest. But it's also about understanding the precursors
Mhm.
to an individual deciding to release information, bearing in mind that it potentially holds serious ramifications for that
Mhm.
individual.
Absolutely, yes.
They can be investigated, they
Mhm.
can be charged. It is not a decision that is taken lightly.
Mhm.
And I'd like to mention the case of the leaker. Well, I'm not quite sure whether that's a good term, but I mention the term because the individual,
disclosure. How about
the disclosure,
the disclosure.
Yeah. In the famous ICIJ investigation
Yes.
of LuxLeaks.
Mhm.
Okay, so the individual there, and now ex-PwC employee, leaked information, and he was subsequently charged
Mhm.
and also convicted
Mhm.
of leaking. Recently, the EU Human Rights Court has overturned that decision. and has granted him the protection as a whistleblower.
Mm-hmm.
Because the decision was that the public interest of leaking was more important than the loss to PwC as an organisation.
Which I think is a really excellent decision, and it again underlines the support for this idea of shedding light on problems. But how many years does it take for these things to move through the court system? It's it's very challenging for any person who is facing that reality, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One needs to, in a sense, put yourself in the situation of that individual.
Mm-hmm.
The precursors to leaking, moving through that process of being convicted,
Right.
and then the process of having that overturned.
Yeah.
Imagine those sleepless nights.
Absolutely.
Imagine the tossing and turning.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine the implications on that person's personal life and well-being.
Yeah.
Sobering.
It really is. But I think that this is a really good point in our conversation to take a break and turn over to a poll that we'd like to ask our webinar attendees to participate in. And so the question for everybody today is, which aspect of GRC do you think needs the most improvement in your organization? And there are 4 or 5, I think 4 elements that are there on the screen for you to answer. Governance, risk management, compliance, or integrating ethics into GRC processes. And it's always interesting to see these as they come up, and we can see sort of live engagement, which also reminds us that there are people on the other side of the camera, which is nice as well.
You also had many happy birthdays.
Many happy birthdays. Well, I would like to thank everybody for the birthday wishes. I didn't realize that was public information. That's good to know. Guilty, okay. Thank you.
Well, I hope you're enjoying your day.
So far, it's been excellent.
Great.
Not least of which because I'm having this wonderful interview with you.
I did bring some sweets from Spain.
Specifically for me, yes.
Specifically for you.
Yeah. Okay, Gail, if we could bring you back to the conversation here. You've said that for whistleblowing to truly work, organizations need to go beyond processes and focus on the human side of GRC. Could you elaborate on what that would look like?
I'm going to try and paint a picture.
Please.
It's really about creating an environment, a culture where reporting is possible,
Okay.
where it's supported, encouraged, and bravely managed. What does that culture look like through the lens of an integrated GRC framework? You know, in the compliance world, we're really good at acronyms.
Yes.
And maybe not that great at dialoguing about what it means. I'm going to try and paint that picture around what is an integrated GRC system through the lens of whistleblowing, through the lens of reporting and speaking up. Let me start with the G.
Sure.
Okay.
At the top.
At the top. So governance is about leadership. It's about management. It's about directing. And leaders really need to decide on the scope of whistleblowing. Exactly what reports are being managed and how are they addressed. Now, Transparency International has issued some amazing insights and research into the whistleblowing landscape. And the key message there is that for whistleblowing to truly work, the scope needs to be as broad as possible. It's about covering any act or omission, any abusive behavior that causes harm.
It's very broad.
Very broad.
Very broad.
And of course, we know that only 12 of 27 countries in the EU have an adequate scope.
Right.
Okay, so that's the legal perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, we know that leaders, of course, in deciding on their obligations, would reference the legal requirements.
Certainly.
The challenge here is that as a leader, you need to be able to withstand scrutiny
Mm-hmm.
and explain why you have decided on a particular scope. Because the question will be, why are some whistleblowers protected and others not?
Mm-hmm.
And leaders need to be supported in having that dialogue with stakeholders who ask that question, and ensuring that their responses are coherent with the strategy.
Okay.
So that's one part of the
Mhm.
G. Another part is ensuring that leaders, in fact, live the commitment to a speak up or reporting culture, and they display their commitment. So that's, the G. And in the interest of time, I know there's a lot more behind that piece of corporate governance, but within the context of whistleblowing,
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to raise those aspects. Let's move on to risk management. Okay.
Absolutely.
The
I'm
next.
always interested in that, especially in an enterprise context.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned enterprise, because often we can see risk from a siloed perspective.
Often.
Operational risk, compliance risk,
Yeah.
financial risk, non-financial risk, and all those different pieces. The challenge is really, if we're working towards, and we are all working towards resilience,
Mm-hmm.
it's about connecting those dots.
Right.
Okay. So whistleblowing, speak up culture,
Mm-hmm.
is about being proactive.
Mm-hmm.
Earlier I mentioned it to be an early warning system.
Yes.
Risk management is all about a proactive
Mm-hmm.
approach to understanding your risk universe. And I deliberately use the word universe because it is quite extensive. So whistleblowing helps us in delivering that proactive risk management approach. Okay, it's about understanding where those hidden risks are.
Mm-hmm.
We can't manage risk if we don't know what the risks are.
Definitely not. And in a siloed context, it makes it so challenging to understand the breadth of risk as it affects different areas of an organization. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then when we start joining the dots,
Mm-hmm.
it means looking at your reports, your whistleblowing report, and reflecting on what are you seeing in your risk register.
Mm-hmm.
What do you have in your incident management process?
Mm-hmm.
What is the message? What is the root cause? And often, the root cause of weaknesses and breaches is human behavior.
Right. Definitely.
So it's going back to, so why do we have that risk? How do we address human behavior? How do we encourage the right behavior? So that's how whistleblowing, through that lens
Yes.
of risk management, becomes a powerful activator and connector. Then I suppose I need to go into the last one,
I think
compliance.
everybody's interested to
Okay.
know, how does that fit in then?
Compliance, again, we talk about compliance with regulation, but we need to remember that regulation is the minimum requirement.
Yes.
Okay. We also need to reflect on what is the purpose of regulation as well. And the purpose is generally resilience, making sure that systems work, organizations work as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's understanding that. And also reminding ourselves that compliance is about human requirements
Right.
as well. Speaking as a lawyer
Mhm.
or an ex-lawyer, ideally regulation reflects human expectations, what we expect of each other, the morality of society.
Well, I like that. I'm going to use that. I'll take that from you. Yeah.
Ideally.
Okay.
But we also know that regulation is very slow to change for multiple
Definitely,
reasons.
definitely.
Our systems are just so archaic.
Mhm.
But that's a different conversation.
No, absolutely.
The need for change in our, legal systems. But coming back to the message that our legal systems are ideally reflecting our human expectations. compliance and compliance with regulation challenges us again to understand what is the human expectation that we're trying to facilitate and enable. So when I talk about compliance, I don't talk about tick boxing through the requirements.
Right, of course.
I try and take my teams and the companies I work with through that assessment of what is at the core, what is the purpose of regulation, and how do we best meet that.
I always love a purposeful approach. I think that makes it makes a lot of sense. It also helps people to tie back to, why you do any of this. And if people don't understand the why, then you can't start to implement the how. I think that's really wonderful.
That is so true. I really love that, that reflection. And if you don't understand the why
would you do it?
Why do it?
Right.
And also appreciating that human side of it. Remember, the topic of today's discussion is the humanized approach.
Yeah.
It's about that human understanding of the why. So it's very nuanced.
Yes. Yeah. And you need buy-in. You definitely need buy-in. But I think I was remiss in not identifying or raising some of the responses from poll number 1, and I'm sure everybody, Gail, is very interested to hear your take on the aspects of GRC that need improvement in the organizations of the individuals who are viewing. So it appears as though we had the highest number of responses in governance changing at 43% of overall respondents, with a balance equally distributed between risk management, compliance, and the integrating of ethics into GRC processes. Do you find this surprising? Or is this about where you think most organizations are sort of contemplating these issues?
I think our listeners really have their finger on the pulse.
Okay. Okay.
And it is refreshing to see. It's a reminder that we all know where we need to focus our attention on.
Okay,
and it's also a reminder that leaders need support in enhancing their level of awareness on a constant basis. And leaders are not these omnipresent gods. They do have a lot of power, but
Yes.
it's a tough job.
Yes.
So, I'm glad to see that coming through, and it's also very, very inspiring, because I think it shows that we're all on the same page in terms of where we need to focus. We're talking about leadership, commitment, transparency, trust, and that's not
It's a big one.
It's a big one.
It's a big one.
Absolutely, and it's not an overnight. You suddenly turn the switch on and you have it.
But it can be turned off
Yes.
very quickly.
That is so true.
Very quickly, yeah.
And again, it's increasing that level of awareness as to how quickly you can turn it off.
I really like that. And I think it actually gives us a great segue into our second poll question, which I think is going to be up in front of you now. And that is with respect to risk management approaches, and specifically how your organization prioritizes risk management. And this time I promise we'll discuss the responses immediately following the answers. Yeah, the idea of the switch with trust, I think it's it's this old idea that if you're accused of something, it happens on page 1, but if you're cleared of something, it happens on the back page of the newspaper. And it's the same thing with trust. It's like it takes so much time to get to a place where you have established trust, but if you've done something to break that trust, it's gone, and sometimes it's irreparable.
Yes, totally. And it's also appreciating that, that can happen. That switch can be turned off. But what makes a resilient organization and resilient people is about how do you come back from that?
Yes.
How do you turn the switch back on? So it's accepting that there's no perfection. And that's how I manage expectations when it comes to the work that I do.
Continuous improvement, though. There should
Absolutely.
be continuous improvement.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And be prepared for making mistakes.
Yeah.
Be prepared for imperfection, but be committed to fixing it as best as you can.
Agreed.
So yes, you'll be switching the the lights on and off on a regular basis, but how do you come back from that? And that's super powerful because you build
There's a whole webinar.
teamwork.
There's a whole webinar.
Okay, there's a whole
in this.
webinar.
There's a whole
on that,
webinar
yeah.
in this as well. So I think now we've got our responses, and we have a bit of a split between the comprehensive and proactive approach. Oh no, maybe that's just gone up one touch, and then we've got just in a close second that parties have processes, but they're inconsistent. So I think that to me that's one that speaks to my experience. There are always good intentions, or often good intentions, but it's challenging to ensure that the processes are implemented in a standard and repeatable fashion. So is anything here jumping out at you as being telling or surprising, or is this, again, based on your industry experience, about where you think people would be?
The 43% for, comprehensive and proactive approach, that resonates with my own experience.
Okay.
And again, it's understanding why that is so. Being proactive is challenging. You asking questions that not everybody wants to hear.
That's true. That's often true.
And you're also faced with, really, do we have to go there?
Yeah.
So it's hard. It's, again, takes me back to that image of looking at yourself in a mirror. How are you brave enough to see what's there? Because you can just walk past.
You can. It's a glance. Just a quick glance.
Absolutely.
Right.
But again, it's a process.
Yes. Just cognizant of time, and
Yes.
I know that we don't have that much remaining. So I'd love to move into our final question before we turn it over to our viewers. And I would love to end with a further note on the human element that you've touched on a number of times during our conversation. And I think it's a really fascinating aspect for all of us to consider, because it is really what joins us together and what can drive the power of these programs. We sometimes forget the number of people within an organization that may be impacted with the filing of a whistleblowing report. So if you had to name just 3 critical actions organizations should be taking to build a credible and resilient whistleblowing culture, what would those be?
Only 3.
Only 3. Only
Okay,
3.
Only 3. I think I would start with supporting the whistleblower, the reporter, the individual who raises their hand. And how do we support that individual? It starts with understanding the challenges that they are faced with when making a decision to raise their hand and to speak up. It's about understanding those sleepless nights of tossing and turning, of trying to make sense of whether this is right or wrong.
Yeah, absolutely.
Trying to make sense of whether this is worth it.
And it's such an important element as well. Yeah.
What is the price
Yeah.
that I'm going to pay
Yes.
in this? And, I could mention so many other facets of the complexity that the individual is faced with. But at a high level, it's committing to understanding that, and also understanding the imbalance of power, that power is really still in favor of corporates, leaders, systems, and what that means for the individual. So when we can understand that and we increase awareness, we can then hopefully support those individuals through the process of reporting wrongdoing. Secondly, within that context of understanding the reporter's context, it's understanding the listener and supporting the listener as well. I've been in the position where I've had to manage whistleblowing reports as the head of governance, risk and compliance, and taking my team through the process of, step-by-step investigation. The reality is that the teams that, especially if it's an internal team that's managing the reports, there's a natural conflict of interest.
Certainly.
And conflicts of interest is normal.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge is how do we manage that and how do we protect against the negative consequences of conflicts. But there is a conflict. So how do we support the listeners and the teams that are managing those reports? We're talking about a lot of soft skills as well,
Mm-hmm.
listening, asking questions, not making a judgment.
Yes.
It's a process of trying to get to the closer version to the truth as possible. So it's supporting those teams in that process, making sure that you have not only the right number of resources, but the right skilled people, and empower them to also raise their hand when they are not properly equipped to manage it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there are some extremely sensitive issues that arise through whistleblowing that
course.
individuals may not be trained to manage. So how do you actually say, I can't do this?
Mm-hmm.
This will not be fair on me, nor on the reporter, nor for the organisation. Again, it's about supporting leaders to increase their awareness around these nuances, the human aspect.
Right.
Thirdly, support the accused as well.
Sometimes forgotten.
Mm.
Sometimes forgotten.
Mm. And yes, we know that there's been a lot of focus on whistleblower protection,
Mm-hmm.
but we cannot forget to support and protect the accused as well. It's a process. It's about being fair. It's about enhancing trust and making sure that that individual or individuals are also properly supported.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gail. Powerful insights, and we're so happy that you could join us today at Speak Up to discuss this very important conversation. And yes, I'm walking away with more questions than answers, but I think that that's exactly as we set it out to be, and I think that that means that it was a conversation worth having. And before we move to the audience questions, we'd like to remind everyone that building resilience through GRC is a journey, not a one-time effort. And we hope that you are able to take what you've heard today along you in that journey to help you build more resilient and human programs to help you solve the issues within your organizations. But we'd love to turn it over now to the webinar participants for any questions that you may have for Gail while she's still with us. Great. We have one here. So, Gail, what role do empathy and business needs play in designing a GRC framework prioritizing employee well-being as well as business growth?
Tough question.
Right.
Especially after about 40 minutes of chatting. So let me see if I can get my brain cells activated. It's a great question, firstly, that focus on empathy, understanding, the individual context, and maybe, it connects to our the last part of our conversation about supporting those individuals in the process. It's about being empathetic, being able to understand the challenges and needs that each individual has, in that framework, and, kind of balancing that with business needs. Again, that resonates with our conversation earlier around how do we increase the level of awareness for leaders, because yes, they are managing, meeting business needs, objectives, shareholders, and multiple other, requirements at the same time. And naturally, there may be a risk of reduced empathy.
Yes.
Because we only have so much capacity.
That's true.
A leader, the CEO, board members, chairwomen, we are all human, and we only have so much capacity. So there'll always be a challenge and a balancing between these different requirements. what we do in, as compliance professionals or as GRC professionals, we help to support those leaders. And when we are, in fact, those leaders, it's about, that constant improvement. But maybe the first realization is accepting that it's a balancing act.
Yeah, I think that that's always something that needs to be taken into account whenever trying to build out any program. You still need to return value to shareholders, but can you do it in a way that is respectful of all of these other processes that are necessary to run a resilient and strong organization from a human standpoint? It's really great. Do we have time for one last one? We do. Okay. This is an interesting one because I struggle with this a little bit as well on the boundary between leaking and whistleblowing. So how would you define that considering the gray area? Where does one begin and the other stop? Is leaking just a subset of whistleblowing, or is that too simplistic?
Another tough question.
That means that everybody was really engaged in the conversation. Yes, you covered all the easy topics, and now it's the tough topics. Yeah.
This is what happens when you open it up to the audience. Yeah. We spoke about the LuxLeaks case and the individual who was convicted of leaking, and that decision having been overturned and now being regarded as a whistleblower with the associated protection. So is there a boundary between leaking and whistleblowing? I don't know.
Okay.
Because it's also understanding the precursors to leaking. So if we can understand why someone actually leaked information, then maybe that provides us with information around, is there a distinction? But
so the motive or is something that you would take into account when trying to... Interesting. Very
absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And then let's not forget that any, fabricated, ill-intentioned whistleblowing report, which does happen, needs to be dealt with as well.
Yes.
So, we cannot be naive. So it's, as you say, understanding what is the motive, because we're talking about fairness. So it's very important that we also manage those malicious reports as well.
Excellent. Excellent. I know. We could talk about this for many hours still because it's a really fascinating topic. I think we actually may even do one further one here. I have it on my screen. So to what extent, Gail, should the board and or executive be made aware of whistleblowing reports once resolved, thinking about simple issues raised? Is it beneficial and ethical to share the types of issues and follow-up actions in an anonymized format?
Let's take that in two parts.
Okay.
I think it's, the question's kind of in two parts. First of all, and I'm reading it as well. So how should the board and executive be made of whistleblowing reports? That forms part of your governance framework. Governance is about, as we said, leadership, direction, management. But leadership, direction, management depends on information.
Yes.
Okay. It's the right information getting to the right committee structure. So now we're getting into the technicalities of governance. I spoke about governance a bit at a high level earlier. So now we get our hands dirty.
But it's good because, as we saw from poll number 1, governance is the most interesting topic or concerning topic for our viewers today. So it's perfect as the last question.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So how do we create those governance structures that facilitate the sharing of the right information to the right people at the right time? Okay. So yes, we do need to ensure that our board and executive teams are aware of whistleblowing reports, because it is their responsibility to know. That's their job.
Right.
So the support networks around our leaders need to be equipped. So how do we design that framework in terms of this is the information, the whistleblowing reports that go to the board? Do we have it as a standard agenda item? If we don't, red flag.
Have the standing. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I agree.
Do we have minutes around it?
Mm-hmm.
What are the actions? What are the expectations? That also helps leaders to explain to their stakeholders how they engage and how do they demonstrate their commitment
Mm-hmm.
to whistleblowing and speaking up.
Mm-hmm.
So, to the first part of the question, yes,
Okay.
but you need to work out how and
Okay.
make sure that that framework works in practice.
Mhm.
Okay, don't just say it, actually do it,
Yeah.
and make sure that your governance mechanism support it.
Okay.
Okay, and that it can withstand scrutiny.
Always important.
Okay,
Yes.
and then the second part, is it beneficial and ethical to share the types of issues and follow-up actions in an anonymized format? Yes, because it's about dealing with the issue
Mm-hmm.
and then also with the individual. But first, it's about dealing with the issue. So yes, allowing for it to be anonymized helps at the beginning to take away the, that possible conflict of interest because you know the person.
Yes.
Also, as humans, we have a tendency to be defensive as well. So if I see a report and I see it's from this particular person, it's like, well, but
It's fight or flight immediately.
exactly.
Yes, absolutely.
Again, so it's
Yeah.
about creating that level of awareness
Mm-hmm.
and that process that we support individuals through.
Mm-hmm.
And those individuals include leaders, your
Mhm.
executive team. So it's about finding ways of supporting them through the process so that we get to a better outcome.
Fantastic. I would like to thank Gail Wessels again for joining us today. It has been a really fascinating conversation for me. I hope that the same can be said for everybody who's joined us via the webinar. And please stay tuned for future events that we will be hosting because I'm sure that each one will be equally as engaging and interesting as this one. So thank you again, Gail, for joining us.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the listeners who have dialed in, and your questions have been super insightful, and it's been an absolute pleasure being here with you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.